have our pitchers, who are on my left, and we will be judging and assessing those ideas put forward. We're going to hear from each speaker. They will present their idea. We're going to ask some questions and offer some reflections, and then I'm going to hand over to you to quiz our pitchers as well. At the end, we're going to have a show of hands vote, because we like, a bit of healthy competition. So no pressure, guys. In terms of who we've got today, so on the judging panel, I'm Caris Roberts, and I'm Executive Director at IPPR. We have Aisha Thomas-Smith, who is Director of Movement Building at NEON, and we have Chris Curtis, who's Senior Research Manager at Opinion. In terms of our presenters, we have Rayhan Hack, who is Campaign Manager at Community Wealth Fund Alliance. We have Chris Thomas, Senior Research Fellow at IPPR, and we have Parth Patel, who's Research Fellow at IPPR. We were due to have Sarah Arnold, who's a senior economist at the New Economics Foundation, but unfortunately she is self-isolating, having been told to just this afternoon, so sorry that we'll be missing Sarah's ideas. But very pleased to have these presenters with us. So, without further ado, we're going to go to our first pitch, which is Rayhan Hack on community wealth funds. Over to you, Rayhan.
Caris and IPPR, so much for this wonderful opportunity to make the case for a community wealth fund, which, ladies and gentlemen, is a transformative policy designed to arrest no community is ever left behind in the country. I want to begin by just sharing some shocking statistics with you. Since 2001, we have lost over 25% of our pubs and nearly 30% of our libraries. Between 2010 and 2016, 70% of the country's youth services shut their doors. Now that's a pretty depressing state of affairs for our social economy, but the pandemic has made it worse because 400 community centres, pools and gyms have also closed. Now, this rupturing of our country's social fabric is most egregious in left-behind communities. Now, these are areas of the country which are not only extremely deprived, but they are also suffering from extreme deficits in their social infrastructure. So think a lack of places and spaces to meet, civic engagement, community organisations, and good connectivity, both physical and digital. And when you compare these neighbourhoods to others which are similarly deprived but have strong social infrastructure, they have worse socioeconomic outcomes across all metrics, worse educational attainment, lower participation in higher education, fewer job opportunities, and those that are available often being in lower paid employment, and significantly worse health outcomes with lung prevalence over double the national average. And there's a really interesting political dimension to this, particularly for the Labour Party, because our analysis found a powerful association between high community needs and an area's propensity to vote leave in the EU referendum of 2016. In fact, that correlation is 3 times stronger than that between deprivation and support for Brexit. So how do we change this depressing state of affairs? That's where the Community Wealth Fund comes in, which would reinvest and rebuild the social infrastructure of the most deprived and left behind neighbourhoods across the country, using the next wave of dormant assets, so that's funding from bonds, stocks, shares, and insurance policies. It would create an independent and permanent national endowment that would devolve spending decisions to communities at a neighbourhood level, enabling them with the right support to improve areas, building community capacity and resilience in that process. Now, the CWF isn't some pie-in-the-sky idea. It's inspired by the success of the Big Local Programme, which is the largest national experiment in neighbourhood-level devolution and community change that has given 150 communities since 2012 across England just over £1 million each to improve their areas. And they have 10 to 15 years to spend this, so a really long time frame. And unlike many other regeneration schemes, communities spend their money at their own chosen pace and according to their own plans and priorities. So no rules, no targets, all community-led. The results can be transformative. In one post-war housing estate in northwest Bristol, Lawrence Weston, where poor transport links left the estate cut off both socially and economically, 30% of children living in poverty, the community has focused on creating and keeping wealth local. With big local money and support, the estate is now being transformed. The community has invested in a new housing development on a derelict part of the estate, a new supermarket, so allowing the community to benefit from cheaper food and jobs, and it has also attracted numerous local services to the area. The partnership has also built a solar farm, the benefits and revenue from which are controlled by the community. It has taken over a disused former youth centre and reinvented it as a community hub, providing specialist support, career advice and a job club, tackling isolation and providing local employment. They even have a £1.8 million health and community centre planned for 2022. And perhaps most excitingly, they have been given planning permission to build a community-owned wind turbine, which is set to be the largest in England. And to give you a sense of the possibilities that accrue from this, the energy they put back into the grid would allow them to generate maybe up to £300,000 worth each year to put back into their community. So this community group illustrates what is possible if trust is placed in local people. They have used a relatively small amount of funding, just over £1 million, to leverage in millions more of additional investment and social value for their area and wider region. The Community Wealth Fund Alliance is gaining momentum. We have over 440 organisations now part of the Alliance, which includes 39 councils, many of which are Labour ones, and over 70 MPs and peers from across the political spectrum support the policy idea. Hopefully, after today's debate, there might be a few more supporters in this room too. Now, I'd just like to finish by making one final point. So, in the Labour Party constitution, and you'll know this better than most people, it explicitly states in clause 4, power, wealth and opportunity in the hands of the many and not the few. Now, the reason why I highlight that is because a community wealth fund embodies those very principles. It put the money in the hands of communities. It put the power and the decision-making in the hands of communities. But most importantly of all, it put the opportunity to create a more hopeful local future in the hands of communities. Thank you for listening.
I want to kick off with a question which is about the moment that we find ourselves in and the pandemic in particular. How do you kind of think about this idea of the fund in relation to the pandemic? How does it speak to that moment, and is now the time to do it?
So I think we've seen in the pandemic the real kind of community spirit that exists in the country. You had over 1 million people sign up to become an NHS kind of support volunteer. I think this is a real genuine community moment. And what's quite troubling in those left behind communities, because they lack the social infrastructure, they suffer from a lack of community engagement and community activity. Because our analysis has found from the big local that those communities that didn't have kind of places and spaces to meet for the community to kind of congregate, didn't have community organizations in their area, and didn't have very good levels of connectivity, they really struggled to lead their change and to lead their program of activities to benefit their area. So what we're saying is that, in this time of national crisis and rebuilding, a community wealth fund would really target support at those left behind areas and help them to develop their social fabric so they can lead their own change in the years ahead.
Great, thank you. I'll hand over to the other judges in a second. I think, just from my reflections, I think this is a really interesting idea. A lot of it actually isn't new, is it? It's, lots of the social fabric has been lost over the past decade, and this idea would be about restoring that. But I think what's interesting about it is the institutionalisation of that, to try and get a sense of permanence in those policies, as well as making it permanent that communities would have a say over where those funds go. So from my perspective, I think that is probably the kind of the fresh and interesting part of this proposal. So thanks, Rohan. I'll pass now to Aisha for her comments.
How did that happen? Can you hear me? Yeah, good, thank you. No, I think it's a brilliant proposal in lots of ways. I think my questions are more about the nuts and bolts of it, which you may be able to answer, you may not. But it certainly felt like, I think a lot of these initiatives, of course, definitely agree with the idea of community wealth ownership and participatory democracy and things like that. From my experience of it, part of what can go wrong is when we underestimate the extent to which imbalances in power and knowledge are replicated in those spaces as well, in those community spaces, and then therefore replicated in the decisions that are made. So I think we can be naive sometimes as progressives, or however we want to describe ourselves, at thinking through, if we just give certain communities X amount of money and X amount of power, then these outcomes will naturally flow from that. So I guess part of the question is around what kind of infrastructural support would there be, or kind of mechanisms and systems in place for making sure that they are spaces in which the outcomes that flow from it are kind of truly redistributive and addressing the community problems, and not just the playing out the interests of the people who have power in those communities. Does that make sense?
It does make sense, yeah. There's a lot in there. So I'll try to address those points. So I think the first thing to say is that the outcomes are very much contingent on the community. You can't have community-led change unless those communities actually feel they can determine what that change looks like. So if you look at the big local initiative, you had some communities prioritizing support for young people. I mean, one of the kind of problems a lot of communities have is that young people, they go off into the cities and, they never come back. So they want to create these opportunities for young people so they, come back and feel like that is a place where they can actually stay. Others will focus on kind of mental and physical ailments. And others will focus on much more basic things, such as just building a community asset or some sort of hub, because quite frankly, you can't have a real sense of community unless there's places for people to meet. I mean, we take it for granted in a lot of the kind of cities and towns we live in, because there are often lots of social infrastructure available for people to benefit from. But in these left-behind communities in particular, that's really lacking. But you raise a really good question, and I guess there's two design principles behind this which are really important. First of all, the money has to be very patient. So a community wealth fund, the idea is that you create this permanent endowment that kind of seeds capital to the left behind areas in perpetuity. And then they lead that, but they have 10 to 15 years to spend it, just like the big local. And our kind of experience has found that you've got to be patient, because communities sometimes will be ready and sometimes will need more time since they want to do more consultation, and also communities will make mistakes, and you have to just accept that as part and parcel of the whole community-led journey. But often they get it right, and then there's a kind of a second element, which is community leadership, which is really important. So to give an example how the big local worked, is that local trust organisation I work for, is this charity, kind of was the kind of delivery partner, the support partner. So we provided mentorship, guidance, support. You have reps in every area, which they're basically community development professionals or organisers. So they have a lot of experience in terms of kind of being able to bring communities and guide them, to lead their own change. That support's available. But we also have this kind of new community leadership academy. So to help these people to feel confident and to lead that change, they get to kind of go through this academy, learn some new tools, learn from others as well. And one thing we also try to really encourage through the Big Local Initiative is just kind of shared learning. So every year we have this kind of big jamborees taking place in a month's time, where all the different big locals come together and they basically they learn from each other in terms of how they do community-led change.
Thank you. I have a follow-up, but I want to let you come in. And then.
Well, I mean, half my questions were covered in your question. So I suppose I'll follow up just to press you a little bit more on this point. How, and also to take it a bit further, obviously in lots of cases there's things where, how do you ensure that you're doing things, you're building things that there's actually going to be a demand for, not necessarily things that sound good to maybe local council leaders or local leaders, but there won't actually be demand for in practice? And then my second question as well is around distribution of cash around the country. Obviously, how do you see this? We're sort of giving money to left behind areas. How are we defining that? How should it be defined? What kind of places in the UK should be winners and which ones shouldn't be in this system?
Just on that last point, back in 2019, Local Trust teamed up with Oxy, so the Oxford Consultants for Social Inclusion, the data geeks that produce the IMD, so the Index of Multiple Deprivation. And we wanted to try to identify, what people mean by left behind areas. And based on learning from the big local as well, those areas, which are poor but also struggling in terms of social infrastructure, tend to really fall behind. We were able to map 225 left behind communities across England, and they tend to fall in these kind of peripheral parts of towns and cities along the coast as well. Former states like Ambition Lawrence Western, for example, and without getting too technical here, but those areas fall within the bottom 10% of the index of multiple deprivation, so extremely deprived. But we also create this community needs index, and they fall in the top 10% of those with the highest needs. So community needs is based on how they're doing in terms of social infrastructure, so places, spaces to meet, in terms of civic engagement, community, organizations, and connectivity. So if they score really badly in that, and they're very poor, that's how we kind of put them into the 225 left behind areas. So that's the kind of starting point. So we think these are the some of the parts of the country which are most left behind. And just to give another example, I think 200 of these areas don't even have a community asset. And so that's quite, that's an example of just how barren, the landscape is for community infrastructure in these neighbourhoods. And then in terms of demand, and I have to apologise on this one because we went to Survation earlier this summer, so not opinion. And we did some polling in left behind areas, so these people that live in those 225 communities I just mentioned. And for a start, nearly 6 in 10 people said that they want much more local control over how money's being spent. And then we probed a bit further and we identified that community facilities was the thing that was lacking the most in terms of investment. And then the third, I think, really fascinating insight was that if there was new money or a new fund set up like a community wealth fund for these areas to benefit from, 75% of people said it should be the local community, charities or community groups that lead those decisions. So I do really feel that the appetite for community-led change is not just latent within these communities, but I think across the country as well.
Did you want to come back on that, Chris?
No. The only other point I'd make is, I can really see how this works from a political perspective as well, which I know is secondary, but obviously important. Our research has shown that there is still a view that Labour can be, but needs to be more of the party for communities, and also it's a really useful and important dividing line with the Conservatives, who are obviously taking a very sort of top-down approach to levelling up, and this being Labour's answer, I think, could be a really, really interesting policy suggestion.
Can I just say one final thing as well? So in the US, as part of his Build Back Better plan, President Biden has also unveiled a policy which is almost identical to a community wealth fund. It's called the Community Revitalization Fund. And it would provide the same amount of money, or thereabouts, for communities that have been forgotten in America to rebuild their social infrastructure. So there is a precedent for this as well.
It was a very quick one. I think it's a shame that Sarah's actually not here, because part of my question was, to what extent do you think that these kind of policies that are more about devolution and community power, I guess, might bump up against some of the, cultural shifts or socio-political shifts that would be needed to bring in things like, for example, universal basic services or living income. This idea that you kind of have community power sometimes versus state intervention. I don't know if you have any quick thoughts on that.
I think just a very quick one. So I mean, like, when communities get confident, when they feel that there is a community, and and then they kind of achieve things, they want to do a lot more. And so we've had big local communities, a number of them, start to explore a UBI. I mean, for their area. I mean, how could they kind of like create one? And then obviously I mentioned Lawrence Western, that that was a community that was really struggling, and what kind of tipped them over the edge was that they lost at FE College back in 2012 and said, enough is enough, this place is just basically be completely left behind unless we do something, and that's where they acted. And over 10 years, they're now at the point where they're going to erect the largest community-owned wind turbine in the country, and potentially, have access to revenues of £300,000 a year, and they can say goodbye to the big local. And local trust, is what basically Mark Pepper, the community development manager, said to me. So I think the possibilities are almost endless, and I think what's really exciting is it's up to communities to decide what they are.
I want to take a couple of questions from the audience, if they're there. Who would like to ask one? Lady in front here.
There's a lot of places around the council in West London which, it representing what's on paper a fairly affluent area, and yet there are areas of huge deprivation within that. So you're probably saying that my
I'll just check if there are any more questions before going back to Rayhan. Any other questions from the audience? And I should have said there is a mic. Any others? In that case, do you want to take that one first, Rayhan?
Sure, yeah. So, it's a really good question, and come back to the point I made in my remarks. If you compare these left behind areas, so they're extremely deprived, and they're also extremely deprived in terms of their social infrastructure, and then you compare them to similarly deprived areas, the analysis shows that they have markedly worse socioeconomic outcomes across all metrics: lower levels of educational attainment, lower levels of employment, and worse kind of like public health outcomes. So it's not that we're saying that other areas shouldn't benefit and those deprived areas shouldn't get investment. Of course they should, but what we're saying is there's a specific intervention needed for these left behind communities because they're basically suffering from a deficit in terms of kind of income and prosperity, but also in terms of social infrastructure. But the idea behind a community wealth fund is that you target those areas first, and then you would start to look at others and expand the program potentially. And I should mention that we also have London Council supporting the community wealth fund as well.
Was there a question in front here?
Wait, sorry. If not, they won't pick it up on the live stream, so that's why.
Thank you. You sort of alluded to the fact that within this fund they should have the freedom to fail when spending the money, that communities will make decisions and some of them they'll go wrong and it won't work. How does that work with if a community is awarded these sort of funds and then it fails and they're not good within their spending? Does it come back? Do they get more? Or is that sort of a one and done and you've spent your money and now another community gets an opportunity? If there is not a fixed fund, but a select number of communities chosen for this, how do you make sure that gain does happen before this fund disappears?
Really good question. And if you look at the big local example, so some areas have basically spent out, they've kind of used up all their money. Now they're thinking about other ways to secure their legs, and others, there's still a long way to go, and they're struggling to kind of spend their money. And the reality is that sometimes communities might have some issues, might not get along, and they might not agree about what they're doing, and sometimes they will fail. But you can create a system whereby money is not getting wasted, because these communities have to produce something called a kind of a big local plan, which kind of sets out what they will plan to do. They've consulted the local area and what they want to kind of achieve. And then we try to keep this model very light. So a lot of community groups are unincorporated, so they can kind of come together very quickly and lead change. And then you will have something called a local trusted organisation in these areas. So they will handle the kind of boring kind of admin, kind of financial stuff. And that acts as a bit of a financial check. And then there's obviously local trust as well. So I think in terms of kind of, the impact, efficiency, and kind of, waste, I mean, it's not really an issue because there are lots of checks in place.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for being grilled with some very good questions there. We are now going to move on. I realise we've done our seating order a little bit incorrectly, but we're going to go to Path next, who will be pitching a proportional voting system. So over to you, Path.
Thanks, Gareth. Hi, everyone. So we're going to be talking about a big but not very new idea, which is shifting to a more proportional voting system. And rather than bore everyone with sort of arguments you've already heard for and against different voting systems, I'm just going to wind it back a little bit and start with what's the point of a voting system? And simply put, it's there to give people a voice. So democracy, at its very sort of most simple definition, is a system of government where power is invested in people, and then people exercise that power usually through elected representatives. But my challenge is, how much power do people actually have? And who are our elected representatives actually representing? And the answer's not as obvious as you might think. It's quite a good consensus now in the political economy literature in terms of who determines big policy questions, decision-making, structure of the economy. And the effect, the influence of the public on some of these big decisions is quite marginal, actually. They do have some effect, but not very much. Sort of, you wind back to sort of things like the varieties of capitalism, sort of intellectual underpinnings of the third way. The public don't even feature in that book. The structure of the economy is determined by industry and all these other people here. understanding's come on a little bit. Of course, people's opinions, public attitudes, public views, public policy preferences do affect the positions of political parties eventually, to some extent, but not very much. And a lot of that is to do with the voting system, which even within the party electorate that are represented in terms of policy preferences and party positions, it's only certain parts of the electorate. The first past the post system, this is the system we currently have, suppresses certain types of votes. Now, it gives rural regions an outside voice, and it, by definition, relatively gives urban regions a smaller voice. Okay, there are potentially reasons for that. But obviously people live in these regions too. So by virtue of that very fact, the first past the post system also suppresses the votes and the voices of young people, of migrant populations, of minority ethnic communities because of where they live. It suppresses the voice of people, insecure labourers, gig economy workers, again, because of where they live. Is that fair? You can see this in policy. These groups I've just mentioned. Someone give me an example of a policy in the past 3 decades that's disproportionately benefited any of those groups. Now, for example, let's take a more recent policy. Let's think about planning reforms, right? The progressive idea, actually, to build more houses, a Conservative Party idea, been scrapped after the by-election in Cheshire and Amersham because of electoral pressures of a certain part of the electorate. That's a part of the electorate that gets an outsized voice because of the first past the post system, because of where these people live, the geography of the people that are opposed to planning reforms. That's really interesting. Is that fair? A more proportional voting system would distribute voice a bit more fairly. It would increase the size of the public's voice on policy overall, and it would also increase the split or the distribution of that voice. So different parts of the electorate all exert a more similar type of pressure on different policies. You'd have more bubbling up of people's opinions, people's views, people's policy preferences on policy. This is a normative statement, but I think that's a good thing. So essentially, to me, the voting system is this conduit between people and policy, public and power, electoral politics and political economy. It's a really important conduit. And it's one that probably deserves a lot more attention because it determines all policies. Every policy you can think of, social, cultural, economic, goes through this conduit. And it's the structure and the design of this voting system is, by definition, bloody important. And I guess I'll just end with a couple of notes because I'm more interested in taking some questions. Let's look at the past sort of 100 years of democracy and the history of democracy in democratic nations. Several countries have moved from a first past the post majoritarian system to a more proportional system. Not a single country has gone the other way. In those countries that have moved from a majoritarian system to a more proportional voting system, you see trust in politicians go up. You see trust in democratic institutions go up. You see general overall well-being of the population, self-rated well-being, go up. Not saying that's causal, but maybe it's more than a coincidence. That was short of 5 minutes.
Chris first on this one.
Every time.
I won't lead in. I've always been in favour of PR. But I always think the strongest argument against, particularly for comrades in the room, is that we have seen, I think it would have been very unlikely that the Labour Party would have survived through 2019, for example, if we were under a first past the post system. Ultimately, we saw Labour Party fall down to about 16, 17% in the polls before bouncing back in the election campaign, partly just because of the first past the post system, to end up winning that election. Is there not a worry that the Social Democratic Party, or the Social Democratic Party in England, or the UK, ends up getting really suffering as a consequence because of a proportional voting system?
Yeah, and that is an argument here again and again, and I was aware I was making this argument at the Labour Party conference. And I think there are 2 arguments for how I see that. So the question, I guess, is an existential threat to the Labour Party as it is today, this huge tent that is the Labour Party, by moving to a more proportional voting system. And I think there are 2 arguments that I would respond to that. And the first is, I guess, more ethical, and the second is more pragmatic. The ethical argument is that essentially what we're saying is that we prefer the first past the post system because it sort of binds and forces the Labour Party to stay together, rather than accepting actually maybe letting voters have more political choice is a good thing. I don't know, maybe that is a good thing. And if people decide to leave the Labour Party to another progressive party, that's not necessarily a bad thing. I think from a normative perspective, I'm for that. I understand not everyone in this room will be. But I don't think that the way to keep the Labour Party together is to have a voting system that forces it to stay together because voters can't go anywhere else, rather than sort of trying to bind together the Labour Party inwardly. The more pragmatic response is that I think there are two choices really for the Labour Party in terms of whether they support a more proportional voting system or not. And that is essentially, do you want to be the biggest party, the biggest fish, not in power? Or do you mind sharing power but actually being in government? I think that is the question for the Labour Party.
The other argument that's always used and is worth mentioning again here is the fact that it does mean that you are going to always end up in coalitions, and that gives a lot of power to the people negotiating those coalitions. So yes, I can sort of understand the arguments about distribution of voters and giving voters more of an equal say against other voters, but isn't there actually an argument that's moving, say, away from the marginal voter who decides an election at the moment to the marginal coalition partner who decides which way they swing?
Yeah, I think that's a really, really strong argument. And it's almost the byproduct of any type of voting system. There are inequalities, and there will still be inequalities with a more proportional voting system. And who's in that coalition? You're right, the smaller party may well have an outsized voice. And that's really difficult to get around. And to be clear, I'm not advocating a move to total PR. The choice is not British first past the post versus Dutch PR. Both of those systems are awful. There's obviously a bit in the middle, which is where most other countries are, Scotland, for example. And it's a more proportional voting system. So I think you can get around some of those inequalities, but of course, there is always a risk that the smaller party in the coalition may well exert undue influence, representative of its vote. Yes.
We just from each other. I think again, I perhaps I'm missing something, but I think I heard a lot about the why and so much about the how, and I was just a bit more interested in the how.
Yeah,
that's the whole question.
Sure. Yeah, that's a quagmire. So what is the how? So there's loads of questions that are sort of coming to mind. So what type of more proportional voting system do we want? Is it single transferable vote? Is it something else? Obviously, we had the AV referendum. And then I guess the other question, the how, is how do you gain democratic legitimacy for what is quite a significant change? Or how do you get a political party to adopt this thing? And I think all of those questions are really, really tricky. And I guess, again, just using the AV referendum example, where that went wrong for me was we essentially asked people, do you want to tick a box on your ballot box, or do you want to write a number on your ballot box? Like, that was essentially how it panned out. There was no communication, campaigning, understanding. Why should we do this? Is this important? What does it mean for power and how you exercise your voice? None of that happened at all. So of course people were like, no, I'll just stick to ticking. So I think that's part of what's missing. So in terms of how, if a political party thinks this is a good idea, whether that's politically or ethically, they obviously then have to understand what people want and what it means for people and what that would mean to their vote, and then try and communicate that in the way. So for example, is a more proportional voting system a way to ensure that everyone's vote counts equally? Well, yeah, it does mean that. That's the whole point of it. So I think that sort of message cuts through a bit more and will help you achieve the how. And then in terms of what actual type of PR we want to do, well, I can't claim to say I know enough about each type of voting system to actually give you a specific answer in terms of which one or what form is right. But I think a blend of something like an additional member system is what we see in Scotland, where you still give some degree of outside voice to rural regions, which aren't completely ignored, but you also have additional members that are more proportional, seems to be the right balance.
Thank you.
Do you want to add any comments?
It was just, I completely agree in your analysis of AV. I think it was like a very instrumental technocratic campaign, and that's a big part of the reason why it failed. I think that this kind of, I guess what you're alluding to, this broader kind of cultural argument that needs to be made is certainly the right one. I guess I'm wondering who would make that and to whom, because I think a lot of the people that you would potentially reach with that might not have, like, there's one world in which they have party affiliations, and then how does that manifest, and then there's another world in which they don't, and then where do they go with that? So yeah, I totally agree on how the debate needs to be had. Just I guess more questions around what the questions that are generated from that.
Yeah.
But yeah, they're the right ones.
I was just say one comment on that, Karis, if that's all right. And I think it's a really good point, because democratic reform is a low salience issue. Like, most people don't care about it. And it's because no one really, like, it's not clear what it means and why it's so fundamental to all policy decisions and the entire governance of this country. It's really difficult to understand that and comprehend that in the right way. But it's not impossible to wrap that up. Democratic reform, it doesn't just have to be voting system reform, but a set or a package of democratic reforms to give people more voices. You could see how that could become a more popular message. Brexit's quite a good example of a democratic reform that got quite a lot of legs, but it was packaged up in a simple way. And could someone do that with, I don't know, devolution, voting system reform, and House of Lords reform? Maybe, maybe not, but I think that's the way you would have to approach it.
Thanks, Gareth. And on my part, I think you've answered all my questions that were there as well. I was going to ask about kind of local representation, but I think you've answered that with your kind of, you know, the different systems that could enable that through an additional member, etc. I mean, I'm attracted to this policy, and indeed IPPR has advocated for it in the past. I think that our democracy is broken currently. I don't think it is working to represent different groups of people, and I think people don't trust it anymore, or the people in it. And I think that risks sleepwalking into, you know, a lot of big problems. I also think that, you know, the demographics have changed, the country has changed, and I don't think it will always be true that the best thing for Labour is first past the post. I mean, it's not like there have been many Labour governments over the past 50 years compared to Conservative ones. So I think it's a bit dangerous to kind of assume that that's always going to be best. I think also one thing that appeals to me about proportional representation is where debate takes place about the direction of the country. And under first past the post, as you alluded to with your big tent, that debate takes place within parties. I don't know if anyone's still kind of slightly reeling from the past week, but I think there is something to be said for a system in which that debate takes place out with parties. So people can pick something that more closely represents their view, and you don't have to be a party member to get stuck in. I do think that could benefit democracy. So that's our comments. I'd like to take questions from the audience, if there are some. So we have 3 questions along this row. There's a mic just coming up with and then.
Hi there. I agree with your arguments, but I'm sort of depressed by them because they're very intellectual, and your analysis, I think, of the AV election is probably wrong, in that I think we lost that because the opponent said, look, this is terribly complicated, and by the way, it's going to cost you £400 million. Made up numbers, but we've been around that one before. It seems to me that there's therefore the case is to make a less intellectual argument, and in this context, it feels to me that we focus on the damage it might do to the Labour Party. Instead, if you want to stop the Tories, this is really the only conceivable way of doing so in the context of where we are. And I don't know if those are arguments that might be more appealing if less intellectual.
No, should I take one at a time?
Let's take these 3 questions, and we'll come back.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Bilal. I was a parliamentary candidate against Ian Duncan-Smith in 2015, 2017, so I bitterly understand the problems with first past the post. In 2017, if the Labour, Green and Lib Dem votes were combined, we would have beaten him by 3,000 votes. And so that's an example of how I can see it can working. My question is a bit more fundamental, and it's about if the problem is a disenfranchised people and a sense of otherness and not connected to their democracy, is this the silver bullet, or is this part of a wider conversation? The arguments behind it as to how you get there, I totally understand and buy, but it feels like if we present this in any way we package of PR as the silver bullet to get people more engaged, and the example you gave where countries that have moved to PR tend to trust their politicians more, I feel that there's perhaps more of a wider conversation of other mechanics as well. So I was wondering, are there other things that would have to come in tandem with this conversation, or is it this is the first step and then everything follows?
I think there was one final question there.
Hi, my name is Chris from Young Philippines. Thank you, Puff, for your idea on PR. So my question is around time frame. Given that we have had a referendum on PR just 10 years ago, and currently there's a pandemic going on, when do you propose that this issue will be discussed again among the public? And how can we cut through the narrative that COVID is still raging? That's why this issue should be less important to be discussed, essentially. Thank you.
Thanks. I'll let you take those three quite varied and challenging questions.
Thanks. Those are all fantastic questions. I actually thought the first two questions had a bit of overlap. So the first question was about, was this argument too intellectual? Absolutely, of course it was. And I completely would agree that that is not how you would win people over into this question. So it was sort of alludes to my comments earlier about the salience of democratic reform, and sort of the example I gave about Brexit as an important constitutional democratic reform that was popular, and how you get that message to chime. So how would you actually get people behind something like a more proportional voting system? And I think the answer was actually sort of hidden in that second question, which was, is this something we do on its own, or is it part of a package of reforms? And I would argue it probably should be the second. There's no way a more proportional voting system alone just automatically resolves people's disillusionment with politics. It's not going to reverse secular trends for the past 60 years about declines in trust, declines in politicians, declines in all sorts of things. But if it's combined with some of the other questions about where power lies, things about devolution, things about the future of the union, democratic innovations, things like citizens' assemblies, these are all things that are picking up wind, probably more momentum than the voting system one. But I would argue that the sum of these things is probably greater than its parts. And the way to get the public on board is not through campaigning on one of these reforms, these quite technocratic reforms that even I barely understand. It's about being able to convey why they're important, and what together they could help achieve, and pulling it back to the thing that everyone wants. People in their communities, as Rayhan said, want more voice. Well, this is how you get that. That third question was about when. Yeah, okay. Yeah, good question, when. And I can't say I've thought through this very specifically, but thinking ahead to the next general election, democratic justice is probably quite an important dividing line between the Labour Party and the Conservative Party. There aren't huge dividing lines, particularly, I guess, on the economic front, but on the democratic front there are. And you've got a Johnsonian government which is moving very much in the opposite direction towards distributing power. It's actually trying to hoard power, not just in Parliament, but specifically in the cabinet, and within himself. You've seen examples of this, sort of, from the prorogation of Parliament to breaking international human rights, to attacking the courts. Like, these are all ways to actually challenge this whole sort of question about democracy and sort of the judiciary and the executive, and the legislative. Actually, Johnson wants to be all of those things at once, right? And I think it's up to the Labour Party to show, actually, look, this is what's happening here. We're centralising. And you can see it filter through in policy, right? The Levelling Up Fund, very centralised. And actually, we've got a very different approach. We want to give more people a voice. We want to share power, and this is how we would do it. So I think there's a clear potential wedge issue here, if it's framed in the right way. Whether the Labour Party do that or not for the next general election, I have no idea, and I doubt it.
Great. I think we'll move now on to the our final picture. So just say thanks very much to Parth. And over to you, Chris.
Brilliant. Thanks very much. The problem with going last is that you see how intimidating everyone else's ideas are. So be kind, that would be great. And I meant to caveat, this isn't official IPPR policy, but it could be if you vote the right way, because our exec director's here. So what I wanted to start with really was a medical mystery that's kind of plagued academics now for about 150 years. And that's in the book A Christmas Carol, what Tiny Tim was actually ill with. And there's no diagnosis that Dickens actually gives in that book.
But what we've seen is, across academic journals, various doctors and medical professionals, medical researchers, dig into the book a little bit to try to work out what was the diagnosis. And the thing that they come to is that it's probably not clear-cut, but it's almost definitely something that if you were thinking about the best way to intervene, the best way to save Tiny Tim's life, it's probably not access to a hospital. It's probably a real change in social circumstance. So it's probably not living in a very squat, smoky house. It's probably not having a family income that's subject to exploitation from an unscrupulous employer. It's probably having better nutrition, and we know that that tiny goose is the once-a-year treat in A Christmas Carol. And I suppose the interesting thing there about Tiny Tim having a disease that's defined not really by lack of access to an NHS, but a kind of disease of poverty, is that I think now we've got the NHS, it's easy to think that we've moved on from those kinds of circumstances, and that the kind of things that in Victorian England were, kind of killing people unjustly, that we don't still experience them. And then COVID hits, doesn't it? And I think we see that all those drivers of health that come from poverty re-establish themselves. So things like squat, crowded housing, things like, let's say, pain, lack of access to sick pay, not having a second home in the country, not having access to public transport, or, kind of your own car, for example, and having to use crowded buses, not, maybe having an occupation where you can work from home or have flexible working. Those were all things that then modulated your risk of COVID, and so your chance of experiencing something quite nasty in the last couple of years. And actually that's true of health more widely. So that's not just a COVID reality. In fact, if we look at almost all health conditions, even not COVID, it's probably those social things that determine whether you get them. And then once you've got them, what your experience is, what your likelihood of it proving fatal is, and how well you can live with that diagnosis. So I suppose if we're thinking now, what comes next on health after COVID-19? Well, the last time we had a major crisis, World War II, let's say, we really focused in on the need for more acute services to meet acute health need, and we designed and delivered the National Health Service as a country. And that's been one of the most humanising parts of the welfare state, one of the most popular parts of the welfare state. But the reality of COVID is it's taught us something else is really important too, and that's the social aspect of health. And so the idea that I'm putting forward here is a universal public health service, so something that says, yeah, okay, we've done really well on the medical. We've developed something that's free at the point of need, that the public really love, that's, incredibly just in many ways. But now we need to translate that into the things that actually make us either sick or healthy and define how our health develops over the life course. So in terms of the nuts and bolts, a universal public health service could, for example, just to give an indication, could be delivered with an immediate £40 billion budget and 5 prescriptions, 5 key social prescriptions that take us forward into that service. Now, 40 billion to contextualise is a lot of money, but it's also only 1/4 of the NHS's budget. So it's not anything like the same amount as in the National Health Service. Those 5 diagnoses could be, those 5 prescriptions could be, to give a few ideas, on education. So within the 40 billion fund for this service, we could give every child that needs it a bespoke bursary that takes them through their school years, and that could be at triple the current value of the pupil premium. We could deliver skills for life and things like the skills wallet combined with income support for people that are suffering health consequences of income inequality. We could provide housing, social housing, delivered on the basis of health, because we know that there's buy-in, and that's a very popular framing for those kind of policies. We've struggled to make the case, I think, in the progressive side of things for social housing for a long time, but the health case could be a really powerful one to take forward. And I suppose the even more important thing is it doesn't need to necessarily replicate everything within the NHS. So the one thing that it should replicate is obviously saying that in the same way that if you've got a diagnosis of cancer, we all agree that that's something that should be funded by the community, that you shouldn't have to pay for your chemotherapy or your surgery or your radiotherapy, whatever it might be. In this case, we're saying, yes, okay, we know that these things, housing, education, they're really important to keeping people healthy, so let's fund them as a community, or collectively, should we say. But it wouldn't have to, for example, be entirely national. You could have a framework, as currently exists at the moment. We have amazing local public health teams that did incredible work during the pandemic, and I think we all saw the value, probably for some of us, for the first time, kind of seeing how those teams worked. So what you could have is really localised delivery based on scaling that system of local public health. I'll stop there because I've given some nuts and bolts, and I think probably 5 minutes worth, but very happy to answer any questions.
Thanks, Chris. Aisha, may I start with you?
Yeah. I'm just like, everything's still landing in my brain. The first thing that I think is, I really like it, and also it feels like all the things. It kind of feels like what you're saying is we get a big pot of money and we use it for all the things, which I'm behind. That sounds good. But I guess just like a bit more clarity on what would be outside of the scope of this. So what wouldn't be included?
Yeah, no, it's a really good point. So I think there's a couple of things there. So one is that I think this is an anchorage point for universal basic services. So I think there's been lots of conversation about UBS. What this does is it adds the NHS's founding principle and the salience of health, I think, to that kind of case. So I think it probably does have some elements of everything, but in some ways intentionally. I think there's kind of growing ability to link different social issues to health. So the ONS has just put together, and I recommend it for those that haven't seen it, a composite index of health, and it measures not just survival and life expectancy, quite blunt measures, but actually everything that makes us healthy and that defines our health. And I think what that gives you a capacity to do, in the same way that GDP sometimes gets used, is to tie together what are the places that we get the biggest marginal gains. So the ones I've talked about are where I think those gains are at the moment, but we have the flexibility to say this is how we best use the money that we do have to deliver the healthiest possible country.
That makes sense. Thank you. Yeah, I think the GDP comparison is a good one, because that's what I was thinking about as the IPPR's kind of GDP dashboard stuff. I think this is kind of similar in the sense that it expands, importantly, I think expands the definition of what we think of as health, right? And I guess that's part of it.
Yeah.
And I just wondered if you had any thoughts on, I guess, that cultural battle or that cultural conversation that would need to happen to make something like this possible, about how we think about what health is.
Yeah, I think it's a really good point. In some ways, so I guess the cultural battle is kind of where it gets to personal responsibility, and so people saying, you know, the reason that we often don't do more public health is that there's a perception that, you know, people deserve what comes to them if you can put it down to lifestyle or social inequality. So I think tackling that head on is quite important. But I think in many ways this takes us slightly past those conversations, because in some cases the kind of progressive case for more public health has stopped at things that are, you know, one step removed. So things like smoking, alcohol, diet, all really important parts of the health equation, but all actually caused by things like housing, education, income level. And I think by moving on to those much more fundamental structural challenges, I think we can bypass some of the more polemic and unhelpful debate, really.
My question is quite similar, in it is a universal public health service. Is that a political tool to rebrand a social democratic welfare state?
Yes.
Great, well that was a quick one. And my second question would be about the culture that would be needed within this service. So the NHS has a specific organisational culture. What would the culture of this need to be, and how would you ensure that this wasn't a kind of centralised state interfering in people's lives, you know, and instead kind of did the things we've been talking about, you know, empowering communities?
Yeah, I think it's really important. So I think the first thing that would need to happen is that the reason I talk about this as a universal public health system rather than a national public health service is that I think one of the things that if we're reflecting on the NHS's worst traits, that kind of centralisation of power might be one of them. And that's something that in the NHS at the moment they're working quite hard against, which is embedding some of the more relational styles, some of the more empowering ways of working. So it's not just we're experts detached over here and you come and see us and it kind of happens once in a lifetime when it's very serious. It's more of a, you know, let's share decision making, let's empower patients, let's make sure that it's a consistent and long-term relationship between people and their health professionals. So I think anchoring this in local delivery, so in the existing public health teams that we have, would be a really good place to start to challenge some of that. And I think it's really important as well that it's not used as an excuse to genuinely do some of the worst elements of nanny. If you look at public health interventions through history, there are times that actually it has become kind of about moralising from people that have power and voice against those that don't. So I think the embedment and the you know, the origins in empathy rather than stigma blame need to be really strong as well. So I think twin track there.
Great. Chris.
Okay, I'll make myself the unpopular person by asking the awful right-wing question. £40 billion is a lot of money. I'm guessing, like, yeah, that's well outside the realms of what you can get by rinsing the rich and doing the popular tax rises. You're going to have to ask the public, normal people who have modest incomes, to pay significantly more in tax to pay for this. My rough estimate here is, if you were to do it, say, through national insurance like the government just has, it's about a 4% rise in national insurance in order to pay for this. Do you think that's a goer?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So I wouldn't raise national insurance, you know, having all kinds of fun conversations. I think one of the really appetising places, and I think the climate movement has led this in terms of their own emergency, is, you know, the kind of there's been an explosion in green tax, hasn't there? And in some countries, the kind of amount that you can generate off green tax is numbers several percentage points. And you can do the same in health. So I think the idea of, for example, salt sugar taxes that was recommended by the National Food Strategy recently, that can sometimes be unappetizing if it doesn't come alongside genuinely empowering interventions. So if you're not going to combine taxes on unhealthy foods, for example, with interventions on nutrition, then that's really difficult. But what the Universal Public Health Service does is it gives you an ability to combine the two. So to say, well, we don't want to have an environment where, you know, corporations can exploit health for profit over here, but we also want to make sure that if we're going to stop that with tax and make that kind of food less accessible, then actually we are intervening in a more positive way over here. So it's a kind of link up that I think is quite powerful. The other thing that you can do is you can experiment with ownership models. So in places like Sweden, there's huge amounts of income generated through things like alcohol monopolies, similar things that are generally there to support public health, but also revenue making at the same time. So I think combining the opportunities to raise revenue with still a public health purpose and then funneling that into public health interventions has a neat symmetry to it.
I might just add to that, the 40 billion figure, where does that come from?
So that would be the costing of 5 core social prescriptions that could form its basis. So the education idea of tripling the pupil premium and having that available as a utilities aspect of that, so meeting fuel, energy and broadband costs. There's a nutrition, so a sustainable nutrition service within that as well. There's an income component, so for people that are under the minimum income guarantee, and looking at my notes.
You can send me the full costing statements right now.
Pitch to follow.
Can I jump in with a follow-up? I don't know if you have looked into this calculation, but one way of, I suppose, getting around my point, which is ultimately going to be the way this is attacked, I would assume, I'm guessing, that if Tiny Tim were to end, Tiny Tim were around today, he might end up in the same situation. But because we've got the NHS, he's going to end up in an NHS hospital and probably costing the NHS a lot more money than Tiny Tim would have done if it had just been given these measures in the first place. Is there any work on how much money this can actually end up saving the government, e.g. through the NHS, by this sort of early intervention is not the right word, but maybe avoiding a lot of these problems being created in the first place?
Yeah, it's almost definitely cheaper, isn't it, as a way to do health work. So you can even just see it from the NHS's budget, which was 400 million in the 1950s, and it's now 150, 160 billion, depending on what COVID bits you include. I think the best thing out there at the moment is that the public health interventions that we have in local places, and those are very limited, deliver improvements to health, so what are called in that world quality adjusted life years, at around a third of the price that medical interventions do, so things like new drugs, for example. So I think you're right. If we're thinking about how do we make sure that we've got a sustainable NHS that can still do its job as the population ages and we have all other kinds of threats, and then also a really strong approach to health improvement, then that's a really good way of putting it.
Great. Questions from the audience? I'm just going to see if there's a few hands up for starting. If not, then let's pass that in.
Thank you. That's really interesting. I'm Sam. I'm a director of research and policy at the charity Marie Curie. It's an end-of-life care charity, and certainly we find we're known for running run 8 hospices across the UK, but actually we see more people through our community nursing services. So actually going into communities, staying in people's homes, often overnight, providing people carers with some time off from the time that they're spending caring, allowing them to get some sleep. And certainly one of the really big challenges is people facing kind of poverty in the home, often not being able to pay their energy bills, often living in the homes which are unadaptable for the equipment that's needed, and all those kinds of challenges that people face. And we're facing more people. The reason we're providing more community nursing services is more people are dying at home, dying in care homes. So this focus on public health really speaks to the needs that people have at the end of life. Now, I have one principal concern with the approach, which is I worry that an awful lot of the money could get sunk into raising incomes, which I think would be, you could spend an awful lot more than £40 billion and still need to put more in order to give people adequacy of income and make sure that nobody face poverty. And I wonder whether you could get the kind of universal kind of service provision that you're hoping for, as well as income adequacy, out of even a £40 billion pot. So I'd say double it, make it 80 billion, but leave that aside. My question is actually about the approach that the government is taking at the moment to try to do more integration of health and social care, which speaks to some of the challenges, albeit without the money, that you seek to address through kind of the public health service. And I wondered, to what degree do you think particularly the approach to closer integration of health commissioning and social care through the creation of ICSs is going to address some of the challenges of improving kind of, well, the integration of health and social care and improve public health for the future? And are there ways in which, albeit without a £40 billion budget, maybe on lower levels of the investment, some of the proposals the government have at the moment could be improved in order to improve some of those approaches for the future?
Thanks. Are there any more questions from the audience? One just there.
Cheers. It's not a question to the final speaker. It's more the first one. So I think it's the only opportunity I get. So thanks for all your arguments. So I'm from Stoke North CLP, a deprived, left behind area. It was 13th in 2017 and it's been promoted to 11th, so we're more deprived now. So I know about deprivation. So it's not so much a question of the political element, more the technical aspect, so you don't have to answer this, could be perhaps a coffee afterwards. But it's the central point that a lack of local public assets exacerbates deprivation, and this is evidenced by the IMD. So then I could challenge the argument by simply saying that this is correlation, not causation. So basically the question is, the punchline, how did the analysis demonstrate that the lack of assets led to more socioeconomic deprivation? But it's a very technical question. You don't have to answer it now, but I'm really interested in your analysis, so yeah, thank you.
Thank you. And then I think Parth is trying to get in there with a question.
This seems like cheating.
Yeah, full disclosure, Chris is my boss at IPPR and we both work in the health team. So kind of, it's a bit of a follow-up to what Karis's comment was. So what you're proposing here is essentially a radical welfare and public services reform, sort of towards that sort of Nordic model of social democracy, or arguably, to be honest, democratic socialism. And I agree that is the way you would have to break the link of health inequalities and deprivation. I wonder, essentially, what the politics of it is. Like, is the health framing valuable? Does it make it more palatable to the voter? Is this easier to sell because you're framing it in a public health way as opposed to, I want to alleviate poverty way?
To you, and then I'll come to Graham for the third.
Yeah, no, great question. So I think on the first, the integration question. So I think if we were genuinely thinking of integration, taking it away from its kind of techie definitions, and Parth and I have done some work on this, and just the amount of definitions of integration is overwhelming. But if we take it out of that debate, then I think there's a lot of potential, but there's only potential if it means working across genuinely in places, different organisations, different public sector charity organisations, doing meaningful things together. And I think that won't come just from legislation. So the government's approach to integration at the moment is legislation, structural change, but what really needs to come is meaningful change in places to how organisations are working together. Unfortunately, the big idea that we have on that is a community wealth building fund. So I'm going to defer points to someone else. But I think developing the infrastructure in places to make sure that actually across the country, if you're thinking, let's work together around health in places, I mean, in some places that's going to be great, isn't it? Because there's lots of charities, there's lots of thriving social enterprises, whatever it might be. In others, the local authority has been stripped down by austerity. There's not very much else. The NHS is the big employer and very powerful. And I think making sure that there's meaningful infrastructure in those places to work around health and that there's someone for the NHS to actually collaborate with, that's the key for me, I think. On your question, Path, which was how useful is the health framing. I was a little bit flippant, I think, on Karis's point as well. So I'll draw this in because I think there is value in saying let's say health is incredibly popular with the public, and so politically speaking, if we want to justify big investment, then having health as a target is a really good way to do that because it cuts through. But equally, I think there's value in it in its own right because health is just a really good measure of the kind of society that I think progressives want to build, namely one that's fair, one that's got economic justice, that's got the right social policies as a foundation. If we look at things like the health index that I mentioned earlier, it's incredibly hard to cheat the idea of health. If you do things that are unjust, if you put in place things that strip away funding from public safety nets, then health will go down. There might be a lag effect, and that might mean dashboards of data are the right thing to bring in to equalise that. But health will go down. So I think there's a value to it in its own right because it's just a useful concept. But yeah, sure, it's also a handy political piece as well. But I wouldn't want that to be seen as its only kind of intention.
It's a very
relates to that point.
Mm-hmm.
That's why.
You want to essentially devolve the power for this to the local authority level, the regional level. By doing that, you're sort of increasing a public health budget by 13-fold if you're going to do it through public health. And do you think the infrastructure exists to do that? Firstly, are you just throwing money at a team who can't possibly handle it? And secondly, public health sits within a political infrastructure, and how do you think that will operate, given that you've got Tory councils, Labour councils, who might have different priorities, and you're expecting public health teams to deliver the same thing within that context?
Yeah, it's a good question. I've just remembered what my last funding component was, and it was the staff. You'd obviously need a really radical uplift in the number of staff and the team cost as well. So I think it's important to do the right capacity building and to have the right components in there. I'd also think about empowering this at a director of public health level, which I think doesn't bypass everything because there'll still be a political aspect to it. But what the Director of Public Health would be really good at is understanding and mobilising the local understanding that they have. So recognising that the material conditions of different places are different, they impact health differently, and coming up, with a plan to use that money that then interacts with the politics. And I agree, but that's kind of the case, isn't it, against any welfare or social intervention. I just think it starts from a slightly stronger foundation.
Great. Before I ask Rehan to come in, can we just say thanks to Chris for his pitch? And then Rehan, did you want to address that question quickly, or are you going to take up the coffee?
Sure, I might do both actually, because we actually have a big local in Stoke North, and the chair of that big local is actually coming down to Brighton on Tuesday to speak on a panel with Steve Reed. And I actually visited Tunstall as well in your constituency, and that's one of the left behind areas, so we can definitely have a coffee or chat. But just very quickly, on this point about kind of correlation causation, in the world of policy research, as I'm sure Karis will know, it's very hard to always kind of demonstrate causation. But one thing we've sought to do, particularly as we're trying to kind of win the battle for a CWF with government, is to kind of show that the economics also stack up. So we commissioned Frontier Economics at the start of the year, and they did a very comprehensive bit of analysis, which showed that for every £1 million you spend through the Community Wealth Fund, you would accrue up to 3.2 million in benefits, and those are fiscal and economic and social. And I would say two things to this. First of all, it's quite a conservative assumption. There are lots of kind of impacts that they weren't able to quantify or monetize, such as improved social cohesion or reducing loneliness, or improving the kind of global green spaces. And the other thing to say is that they only used evidence where there was a plausible causal link. And they kind of modelled it on what the big local had done over the last 10 years. So yeah, just kind of, reassure you, we're very confident that, the economics will stack up on this.
Great. Well, thanks very much. 3 quite different ideas there, and it's now our turn to decide which one we favour. I'm going to ask our judges for some closing comments before I ask you all to vote.
Me?
Yeah.
You've been nominated, Chris.
Do you want us to say which our favourites
Well, this is the thing. I don't know what the thought.
I think the difficulty, given the job that I do, is however hard I try, I just can't get out of a sort of strategy mindset of which of these still I think is going to be most helpful to the Labour Party to win over swing voters in marginal seats. And I think, and therefore I'm afraid I think my answer is, and all 3 of them I support and think are good ideas, but I think my answer is based on that. I've done loads of work on this, a recent report out looking at this, but one of the big things I think is one of the very few narratives that still works incredibly well for Labour is this idea of building stronger and safer communities. And I think that it gives a really good dividing line for the Labour Party, but between the Labour Party and the Conservatives. And therefore, I think the community fund is a really sort of powerful, persuasive idea that can help Labour and give them an alternative to the Conservative Levelling Up Fund. Not to say that all 3 of them aren't brilliant ideas, but I think that's the one that I'm definitely most tempted by.
Do I have to pick one?
It's up to you.
Oh, well. No, I mean, I think as someone who spends a lot of my time working with campaigners and activists and folks who are organising against specific things, it's just really refreshing to face with lots of ideas, and not that there aren't ideas there, but these are the things we're advocating for and how to by them. I think if I had to, I'd probably Chris's health program. He's like, yeah. And I do love them all, but I think the part of the reason I would go with you.
A show of hands. Previously, when we've done this in other years, we've had people shout, "But we don't favour competition." So you can also do that if you want. So the red hands idea. Can I have a show of hands?
Are we going to transfer over?
I'm afraid my counting skills are probably a bit too weak for that. Chris, for Chris's idea, sorry. Gaining.
Lots at the back.
And for Path's idea. It's very comrade ideas. So I think probably Rehan has just edged it, followed by Chris and then Path. But I think what we've found today is exactly as Aisha says, that it's actually extremely energising to be talking about new ideas and ideas that could be very popular and also improve our country. So thank you very much for coming along and being part of the conversation and asking your excellent questions. We do have a whole suite of events. This is the first of many, so do check out the Fringe Guide. I think the digital guide is much more up to date than the printed one, so probably look online for the events coming up. And I hope you have a brilliant conference. We'll see you soon.